Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining today. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Brad Roger, Director of Product at Qube Technologies. As most of you know, Qube is operating across more than 10 countries in every US basin. Our technology is deployed in oil and gas, agriculture, mining, landfill environments, and we're approved for regulatory use. We're also being used for OGMP 2.0 level certifications. And I want to give you a quick snapshot that sort of illustrates the scale of experience behind the model improvements you'll see today. So some interesting statistics here to help kind of illustrate. So we've ingested over 52 billion data points, represents an equivalent of 6,300 years of device installation time. And our modeling engine has now simulated the equivalent of over 2,100 years of real-time emissions behavior across all of our monitored facilities. So these numbers kind of reflect the breadth of environmental conditions, different facility types, and leak behaviors that sort of shaped our next generation emissions model. So today I'm excited to walk you through the next evolution of Qube's emissions modeling engine. It's a system built on kind of everything we've learned over the past several years. So our goal is straightforward. We want to deliver accurate, more robust emissions quantification across the toughest environments. So from complex oil and gas facilities to mines, agriculture like mirror lagoons and RNG facilities, and landfills. So the upgrades you'll see today, they span dispersion physics, source modeling, localization, logic, and event estimation. And by the end of the session, hopefully you'll understand not just kind of what changed, but why these changes materially improve detection reliability in rate accuracy and totalized emission inventories. But before diving into the enhancements themselves, I think it's useful to level set on what the emissions model actually does. But at a high level, our system uses devices deployed around a facility, commonly along the fence line, but increasingly at closer proximities. But we measure wind, environmental conditions, gas concentrations. And Qube devices can detect, CO, CO2, H2S, NH3, particulate matter. But of interest to this model is of course methane. So with just a handful of devices around the perimeter, we only have observations at a few specific points in space. But as we track these readings through time, combined with our physics-based dispersion modeling, we reconstruct a picture of what's actually happening inside the facility, across all corners of it. And so we can tell you where methane's being emitted, at what rate, and for how long. Now, obviously, this requires some trade-offs. We're modeling a facility with sparse sensing, dynamic winds, overlapping leak events, and it's all inherently very complex. We also built the model to be highly robust. So these are IoT devices after all. And so we're subject to the whims of cellular connectivity, solar power, the odd Cloudflare outage or AWS outage. And so the model's job is to be robust and the most faithful representation possible given all of the available data. So looking at the problem space, this slide shows a simplified view of emission rate over time. If you think of an emission as one of these rectangles, quantification is just an area under the curve problem. So rate times duration, obviously both of these dimensions matter equally. So rate comes from understanding plume behavior. It's that physics that we're talking about. So how methane disperses from a source. And then we use all that environmental data that we're gathering and a physics model to infer that upstream release rate from the concentrations measured downstream at just a few points. And then the duration piece, that's all about accurately determining when the emission started and ended, obviously. But this gets tricky when winds are shifting, when multiple emissions are overlapping. So for example, if you had a couple of those boxes overlapping, if you have a long-running low-rate emission, for example, and in one area of a facility, and then you have a short high-rate burst from another part of the facility, you really don't want to combine these into a single event. And so this is where that multi-piece really comes in. So we've been calling this the multi-source model, but in reality, it really reflects a suite of enhancements. So the items at the top of the list there, the top two, are all related to dispersion physics. It's that y-axis piece of the problem. So this is the engine that really just converts those raw concentration values into rates. Then the multi-source piece, that is obviously foundational. If the model can't correctly separate overlapping emissions or accurately localize multiple active sources, no amount of sophisticated physics downstream can really fix that. And then finally, we have the probabilistic duration model, which is critical for situations where wind variability or limited coverage makes event boundaries ambiguous. So PDM is especially relevant for those doing OGMP reconciliation, where understanding continuity, I think, is essential. It gives the model a more principled way to extrapolate through those short visibility gaps in time. So we'll talk about all of these sort of one by one. But first, let's talk about testing. So this new model was deployed at CSU's METEC facility during the AIDED campaign this summer, and results are just coming out now. So it ran in our production environment in real time for the full 13-week controlled release program. This was a blinded study. We submitted our predictions without knowing the ground truth, and then afterwards, we were able to compare directly to the actual emissions. As many of you know, I think the METEC facility is meant to simulate an oil and gas facility, and while it's not perfectly representative, it's still an excellent environment for assessing how well the entire system performs, right from the hardware to the model. So this year, they dramatically dialed up the complexity. What you're seeing in this animation is just 1 hour of controlled releases sped up. So they maintain similar complexity for the full 13 weeks with 10 of these low rate emission sources running almost continuously. You can see on the left and right there, those were basically constantly running. And these were intended to simulate combustion slip. And so then they mixed in periodic higher rate releases also from other leak points across the facility. In total, there's about 24 of them. And so these long-running low-level emissions, they contributed almost a third of the volume that they released this year. But the actual release points were only emitting at about 0.1 kilograms an hour each. So they really stress tested the limits of what you can do with a fence line system. So the chart on the right just shows how complex the release scenarios were. More than 90% of the time, there were 11 or more simultaneous emission sources. So it's essentially a worst case scenario for this disentangling of overlapping plumes, and really a stress test for the multi-source model. So we published our results in a blog post recently, if you want to dive deeper, and there's more to come soon, more analysis. But here's a representative 2-week period. So the top plot is showing the ground truth emissions, and below you can see the Qube predictions. And what's remarkable is how consistent the performance was. We can look at any 2-week period and they all look very similar. So we reliably identify high rate individual events, and we accurately captured both their rates and durations, even with all the background complexity going on. Here we break down the performance into 3 buckets, all looking at emission rate on the x-axis. So on the left, the blue bands are showing ground truth versus predicted rates. And you can see the 1-to-1 line there. And so our predictions generally fall within the 1 sigma accuracy. So that's what the blue lines are representing, is 1 standard deviation away from that, away from our predictions. And so we generally fall within 1 standard deviation, and it's often quite a bit tighter. In the center, we're showing a fraction of 15-minute periods in which emissions were correctly identified. So we have a blog post kind of talking about probability detection and time to detection and how those link. But this being a 15-minute period, it means that even on that left side with a 40 or 50% hit rate in a 15-minute window, this actually corresponds to something more like a 90% probability of detection if you're looking at hour-long time spans. And then obviously beyond that, those higher rate emissions were almost 100% detected. And then the right plot, this shows our cumulative predicted versus ground truth emission volumes, and this is grouped also by it's all grouped by total group release rates. And so you can see how much of that total volume was emitted at in those lowest rate bins. And so you can see how challenging those conditions were for our system as well. And so those previous charts were all shown grouped by the source groups. But if we look at the individual source rates, so each source, what was it emitting? And all of those combustion slip sources that we talked about, those are all emitting at 0.1 kilograms an hour. So this is well below what we would probably advertise as our minimum detection limit, and probably for any fence line system, to be honest. So these low rate emissions, they accounted for a third of the total emitted volumes. And so when we include all emissions, we actually under-quantified by about 30%. But what we're showing here is if you filter out emissions and only show emissions above 0.2 kilograms an hour, our quantification accuracy for the entire 13-week period was within 5%. So every technology has a minimum detection threshold, and above that threshold, Qube system quantified extremely accurately. This performance isn't limited to oil and gas, so we've deployed the model at large mine sites, biogas facilities, covered and uncovered manure lagoons, environments with complex emission profiles and massive physical scales where this really matters. We've also validated at landfills, so both active and reclaimed. This Flux Lab controlled release test program that we ran through, it simulated landfill scale emissions, so both spatially, so large scale, and then also in rate, and so larger rates as well. And on the right, you can see our predictions versus the ground truth, and our slope falls within 10% with an R squared of 0.8. So very little bias, very little spread. So we were really proud of these results. And all of these enhancements collectively that we've made to this model, they enable the model to perform well across a really diverse range of site types and leak behaviors. So now we'll go through the actual changes made. And so we'll start with turbulence intensity. So wind variability is a factor that often kind of gets lost when you're looking at averaged wind roses or hourly summaries. We sample wind every 8 seconds, and even between those points, I think there's a lot of activity. If you ever look at an anemometer, you can see how much it really moves. And so turbulence, rapid fluctuations in the wind's direction and speed, this drives dispersion. And so traditional plume models, if you're just using environmental factors to estimate a sort of textbook turbulence intensity using averaged values, you're often missing what's happening kind of from moment to moment. So this animation shows why. I've dialed up the wind variability in here, and you can see that by ignoring these rapid shifts on the left, we're showing just sort of how the plume gets sort of translated left and right. And the molecules, in reality, they aren't politely sort of sliding left and right with the wind direction changes. They're going to mix chaotically and interact with each other, and that's going to drive up dispersion. And so our updated model leans more heavily on those real observed variabilities rather than using sort of textbook classifications. Captures more of the real physics without requiring computationally expensive CFD. Another key learning we had was from observing nighttime pooling. This is an issue that we've come across a fair amount. And initially, I think we assumed that it was just kind of due to reduced wind speed. It was often a nighttime phenomenon where you'd get a lot of elevated readings across a facility. But what we found is even controlling for that wind speed, the behavior persisted. And so what we realized was the missing piece was solar radiation. So during the day, obviously sunlight hits the ground, and there is a heating action that drives convective turbulence. And effectively, we're pumping the plume upwards and outwards and spreading it. And so at night, without solar heating, the atmosphere becomes highly stable and this dispersion collapses. So this is the same mechanism behind temperature inversions, where you see trapped fog or clouds early in the morning, especially on calm evening environments. So this model now incorporates that it uses solar angle, so it's based on latitude and time of year, and it uses that as a direct input into stability. And so now we better capture both daytime and nighttime dispersion. So the next one is a little less intuitive, I'll say. In a perfect world, we'd have a full 3D model of a facility, and we'd run CFD, like I was saying, to simulate every little bluff body interaction and every leak's initial velocity and direction. But obviously, that's not practical. And given the limited information we typically have, especially around the exact leak mechanics at the source, the challenge is, how do we approximate these real world near field effects in a way that improves the model's fidelity to true release rates, again, without resorting to expensive techniques? So this is where the source geometry comes in. And historically, the model has always treated leaks as point sources with no initial dimensions or velocity. Kind of mathematically, they start from zero. But what we found is that modeling certain leak sources as 3D shapes, spheres or cylinders, for example, and then if we treat the emissions as actually emanating from the surface of those 3D shapes, this actually significantly improves accuracy. So what's happening is we're effectively predispersing the plume. It increases turbulence near the source. So you can see on the right, if these were tanks, you can see on the right that plume is a lot more dispersed right as it emanates from the tank. And so by the time the plume reaches the fence line, it more closely resembles a real world plume, especially in environments with a lot of strong bluff body effects near the source. So these tanks are a great example. If you've ever seen tank top emissions, they tend to have sort of a downwash effect where the emission emits from the top, and then it'll roll over the side of the tank, and it creates this complex swirling and this complex 3D behavior that's nearly impossible to model explicitly. But with this volume source approach, it actually sort of mimics that impact when measured some distance away. You can actually see this visually from some work out of Dort Hammerling's group out of Colorado School of Mines, where they've done the CFD model of a tank top emission. And you can see on the right here what this looks like at the fence line compared to just a simple Gaussian puff or Gaussian plume model would be similar. And so that 3D geometry that we're adding, where we have the emission emanating from the entire surface of that geometry, and again, it's a 3D thing, so we're getting that kind of that effect of the elevation as well. This ends up looking a lot more like what we're seeing in our model, again, without having to resort to the expensive techniques used. And here you can see the resulting improvement in rate estimation. So this is specifically the tank emissions on the right here. We're showing ground truth versus predictions, and that one-to-one line we're at 0.92 slope and an R squared of 0.86. So again, low bias, low variance. And so that's what we're after. And again, these are from elevated release points. And so that's often a question we get is how are you detecting at the fence line something that's being emitted 20, 50, 100 feet in the air? This is the complex 3D dynamics of leaks that we aren't always able to model, but you can see very clearly when we look at the model results. And bringing back this time series plot, you can see the tanks are the red items, and visually you can just see how well the model detected essentially every tank emission, which was a powerful validation of this approach. So I see there's a question. I'll try to address this now. So, what is detection limit of the methane sensor in ppm? Is that kind of what the question is? So the actual methane sensor, it has a sensitivity of around 1 ppm, and so that's something that I think that gets missed sometimes is when we look at satellite images, for example, of plumes, and they look quite narrow and skinny, and they're sort of going only in one direction. The sensitivity of our instruments versus what you can see from space, it's quite a lot higher, and so again, with that variability in space of how much the wind is moving around, we end up detecting quite a lot. Another question: when deploying the site, how much a priori knowledge of leak sources is needed to identify leak points? Again, that's sort of where we are taking some shortcuts, I guess. For example, this on the left, we're showing this leak again, kind of emanating from space, zero dimensions initially, zero velocity initially. It's really impossible for us to know what is the velocity unless we are specifically saying that this is a thief hatch, and here's the design of the thief hatch, here's the diameter, here's the pressure of the tank. We can't realistically record all that information for 3,000 facilities which we end up monitoring, and so we're taking shortcuts again. What we're doing on the right is simulating all sorts of different release types by doing these sort of these kind of shortcuts by predispersing the plume and simulating what a plume would do when hitting all the bluff bodies nearby, when rolling off the side of the tank. And so, yeah, and again, at the fence line, we're monitoring far enough away that a lot of these effects, a lot of these near field effects where maybe it started out as a jet, maybe it started out diffuse, maybe it started out with, a high vertical velocity. All of these effects get um, sorted out in the wash when you're measuring 50 meters away at the fence line. I don't know if that helps answer those questions. Feel free to follow up. If there's more questions, let me know. So now we're getting to the core of the actual multi-source model. And so this is around how do we localize when there's multiple sources emitting at one time. So the existing model treats elevated methane readings from any device as evidence of an emission, and it uses wind direction to pick the single most probable source. And so when there's two emissions ongoing and you end up with sort of a probability tie, the single source model is forced to just choose one. And in this example, where you're combining data from multiple leaks into a single emission, you end up with major quantification errors. You could example a 100 ppm signal on the left from a leak right beside the device. It's going to be a lot different from 100 ppm reading from a leak 20, 30, 50 yards away. The physics is going to be a lot different. And so the new model changes this. When probabilities are close, we split into multiple emissions. So this is a real world example. We have some tanks in the north and then compressor buildings in the south. So this is a large facility, lots of activity ongoing. I think we're looking at like a week in the timeline. And so obviously there's going to be concurrent activities at either location. And with the single source model, readings from across the site often kind of get blended into one long event. And so you can see in the timeline, we've got these long duration events that are multiple days even. And this kind of creates a stickiness where an emission starts, it gets localized, and then readings from devices across the site all sort of contribute to that one emission. And you end up extending events unnecessarily and misattributing concentrations from different devices from kind of all across the facility. And it all goes towards that first localized source. And so you tend to over or underestimate, kind of depending on how wrong that misattribution is. This is another example from a landfill. And so you can really see it here where we switched over right in the middle. And the single source model has sort of these single emissions that lead to localizations where they just get stuck on a source. And then you end up actually with overestimations in this example, where the rate is overestimated based on this misattribution of concentrations. And then on the right, we can see this is a much more realistic simulation where different parts of the active face of this landfill, they're all emitting simultaneously. But we're able to help the operator actually differentiate where to focus attention, where are those emissions coming from largely versus where are they not coming from. So we're able to split out and the heat map basically showing where emissions are coming from is going to be a lot more accurate. Now, to avoid splitting too aggressively, so for example, if you had a 16 tank farm, rather than always saying that each tank is equally probable to be leaking, so let's just say that all 16 tanks are emitting all at once. We didn't want to do that, and so we built this clustering algorithm. And so this groups sources that the model can't really reliably differentiate between. And it uses device locations to determine that. And so the model basically just won't split emissions within the same cluster. And so here are some examples. This in the middle obviously is METEC. This was done algorithmically though, based on the device locations. And so you'll see, a large enough facility, it's going to cluster into pretty reasonable groups where if an emission is coming from that cluster, you can generally find it. It's a fairly small radius, but it's enough that when you're far enough apart that it is going to split those emissions. And actually, one observation that we found in developing this clustering algorithm is that it actually gives some really good insight into how well a deployment can actually differentiate between sources. Just seeing it visually is quite helpful. And so this is something we'll probably try to use moving forward to help optimize deployments, actually. So we're not just optimizing device locations for coverage, but we're also able to optimize for source differentiation. How well can we detect if an emission is coming from different parts of the facility? Maybe we aren't happy with how things are grouped. We can actually tweak the locations to get better differentiation.
Differentiation is the process.
Sorry. The final piece of this is the probabilistic duration model. And this is actually borrowed from some work by Will Daniels at the Colorado School of Mines. So when we design deployments, obviously we're optimizing device placement around prevailing wind patterns. We're trying to get devices downwind of potential leak sources as much as possible. But with wind direction varying so much over time, most sources generally achieve pretty good downwind coverage when you look at longer timescales. It's when you're looking at shorter timescales, so 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. In the short term, the winds can shift in unfavorable directions, and you temporarily can have the plume kind of pointing away from the entire network of sensors. So the PDM approach starts by calculating that source coverage. We can tell if the plume, if a leak source is covered by the devices. And so if a sensor is downwind of a source at any given moment in time, that is good coverage. And then once we know that coverage, whether it's covered or not, we can examine periods when methane readings drop, and then we can evaluate, did those dips coincide with periods of reduced coverage? So this is kind of a simplistic example, but we can see readings on the top left. We had some activity, and then we look, and source coverage is quite good. If we notice that plume drifting away, we will actually calculate that, okay, the wind direction is now such that coverage will drop. And if we see a coinciding drop in concentrations, the model will keep that emission alive. And so if the gap is short enough, again, we're talking about time spans of 5, 10, 15 minutes. We're not going to be extending emissions by days or weeks or anything. But if the gap is short enough, the probabilistic duration model, it's asking a probability question. How likely is it that emission genuinely stopped right at the moment when coverage dropped off, and then restarted exactly when the interval, during the interval when the coverage was regained? In reality, the scenario is extremely unlikely, and especially over short time spans. And so PDM maintains continuity. Unless there's strong evidence that the emission is truly ended, we'll keep it open. So one of the best ways to visualize this, I like to use the example of a panning security camera. So you don't always have eyes everywhere, but if you have the camera panning and you see a robbery in progress and the camera then briefly pans away, you're obviously going to assume that robbery didn't stop the instant the camera moved. You're going to assume that it continues while out of sight. And if camera pans back after a few seconds or minutes later, you're not going to assume that a new second unrelated robbery is happening. It's clearly the same event. And so PDM is using that kind of same logic. Short-term blind spots caused by shifting winds shouldn't artificially chop emissions into multiple pieces or stop them instantly. And instead, the model is using that coverage probability to preserve kind of realistic continuous emissions when the evidence supports it. So I moved through this pretty quickly, but just to wrap up, bringing this kind of all together, over the past few years, we've accumulated enormous bodies of real world data. Like I said, over 57 billion data points and across thousands of facilities, different facility types. And we've been able to use that experience to fundamentally elevate how our emissions model understands the world. The improvements you've seen today from more realistic turbulence, solar turbine dispersion, the geometry-based source modeling, multi-source localization, obviously, and the probabilistic duration model, these effects all work together and create a system that performs reliably in environments that are more complex, more variable, and more dynamic than ever before. In practical terms, it means more accurate detection, more trustworthy quantification, trustworthy localization, which is important, and a clearer, more defensible picture of true emissions. So it means we can now handle overlapping sources, shifting winds, diffuse plumes, near-field turbulence, and all the messy real-world conditions that define modern industrial sites, whether it's oil and gas, mining, biogas, and particularly landfills. As in Flux Lab, as we've shown there, these enhancements can hold up under extremely challenging and highly volatile test environments. Before we close, a quick note on rollout. We have worked directly with some of our customers who already are running this new model, and the transition to date has been smooth and well received. We do have a soft target to migrate all customers to this new model by the end of the year. If you have any site-specific questions or concerns about timing at all, please reach out to your customer success manager. We want to make sure that this transition is seamless for your deployments.